Welcome everyone to this talk. I'm very proud to present all the way from Canada, Karen Collins, who's a professor at the University of Waterloo and the director of BEEP and also the Canada Research Chair in Interactive Audio. Please give her a big round of applause. Welcome, Karen.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, so I am 42, which means I started playing games back in the days of Pong. My very first game console at home was a Pong clone from one of the local stores. I then had an Atari 2600, an IBM PC XT, which was the first IBM PC, a Nintendo NES, and a variety of other games over the years. So I have been playing games pretty much for my entire life, and pretty much since the first days of video games. I have been researching games and game history since about 2002, which means it's almost 15 years spent studying games, looking specifically at game sound and music. I have, in that 15 years, published 6 books on game sound and music, several games, and most recently a documentary film project where I went around the world and filmed interviews with game audio professionals from Japan, United States, Europe, Canada, and interviewed about 100 people all together to put together this documentary film and web series about the history of game sound. And so this subject is near and dear to me as far as looking at game sound history. And I think that there's a lot that we can learn from old games, so I would just like to talk about a few things today. I've tried to cram in some inclusivity stuff near the end of my talk, just so I can speak to that as well, which is also a subject that is near and dear to me for reasons that will become obvious as I get through this talk. So I'd like to kind of focus first on a non-game audio subject, but looking at game history and what we can learn from looking at old games, and then talk about game audio, and then look at inclusivity. So it's easy to look at video game graphics and see how much games have changed over the years. And usually if you look up game history, you get some kind of image like this where you have an old game juxtaposed with a new game, and we're supposed to be wowed about how much better things are today. But I want to show you that there are things we can learn from older games, and that games aren't necessarily better today. So I'd like to first take a look at the issue of game difficulty. There's been a lot of talk about games having become too easy today. And certainly games used to be a lot more difficult. But what can we learn by going back to old games and studying that difficulty? What can we learn from that about game design today? Well, people used to like difficult games. I can remember these puzzles coming out that were being sold as, this is the most difficult puzzle. It was the most, this is the hardest game ever. And that was a point of pride to make a really difficult game. Whereas today we're kind of doing the opposite and making games that are too easy. Rubik's Cubes, they're really difficult puzzles to solve. And I remember, you would pick up a puzzle, pick up a video game, whatever kind of game it was, and you would be playing it for many, many days, weeks, months, even before you managed to solve some of the puzzles. Whereas today, we're sort of in this mode of instant gratification with our puzzles. For most of us that played video games back in the 80s, we spent most of our time dying and repeating actions until we got them right. And that was actually a lot more challenging back then when you had to actually put money into a game, and you would have 25 cents and your game would last 2 minutes, and that was your allowance for the week. Like that's it. And you'd have to come back a week later and try and play it again, and maybe you last 3 or 4 minutes the next time, and so on and so forth. Whereas now, you've got your games, they're portable, you've got them on you 24 hours a day, and there's no penalty for playing as long as you like. But we still wanted to play back then, so why? What was it about the games that we wanted that kept us coming back for more and more? What was the reason why we kept wanting to play, even though the games were short and we often were penalized quite quickly in the games? So we've learned a lot about game design over the years, and most game designers build games today around this concept of flow. You're probably all familiar with this. That is, there's a certain zone of enjoyment when we play games. If a game is too hard, we give up because we're frustrated. If it's too easy, we give up because we get bored. So there's a zone in the middle there where it's just the right amount of frustration, just the right amount of easiness, and that changes over time as our skill in the game increases. So levels get more difficult as they go on, and so on. And most games today are really good at scaffolding our skills. So initially, we learn to jump, then we learn to swing a sword, then we learn to jump and swing a sword at the same time, and so on. So our skills build over the levels and get more difficult as our skills increase. Older video games tended to do this kind of intuitively in that early levels tended to be quite easy, and then very quickly they got more difficult. Most games had a kind of infinite or nearly infinite level of difficulty, by which I mean, on Space Invaders or Pac-Man or whatever it was, levels would get repeatedly more difficult in kind of infinite scale until we just eventually would die. You would never win or lose the game. You would just keep playing until the game got ridiculously difficult. Home console games, likewise, generally were much more difficult than today's games, in part because game designers didn't yet understand aspects like playtesting and understanding their audiences. So I'd just like to focus for a minute on what happened when games were too hard. So usually we have some kind of hint system. Back in the 80s, I played a lot of really difficult adventure games, and there was no internet in those days to look up the answers to solving these problems, so how did players solve the games? Well, you could order a hint book, and some companies had sort of premium phone lines where you could phone up and get a hint for the next level of the game. And I remember getting in a lot of trouble because I used Sierra Online's hint phone system and then lied to my parents about why their phone bill was so large. And so it cost a lot of money. There was a penalty there with trying to get hints to solve the game. The books, as a kid, they were prohibitively expensive. You'd be lucky if somebody in your neighborhood had one. Usually you didn't have one yourself. And you'd have to order them by mail order, which back then took many months to send your money off and hopefully get a book back in return a few months later. Books usually had some kind of decoder. So LucasArts, for instance, used color to scramble the fonts. So you couldn't accidentally see the clue for the next part of the game. You had to hold the decoder over the hint to see that specific part of the game. So there were no sort of spoilers as far as what was coming up ahead. You could progressively move through it much more slowly. Hint books were kind of interesting objects in themselves. They're usually full of humor. Some people, there was a rumor that they sold more copies of the hint book to King's Quest than they actually sold the game. They were kind of objects that people liked to have. They weren't just about the clues. It was kind of an accessory to the game. Your hint system most likely was your classmates at school, and I remember discovering and sharing secret locations of blocks in Super Mario Brothers. And we would spend hours and hours and hours playing these games trying to find those hidden blocks. And then there was a huge amount of excitement you'd be playing this game at night and you would discover a hidden block, and the next day you'd be dying to get to school so you could share with your friends that you found this hidden block. So it was a really exciting thing to do to be able to discover these solutions. And I can also remember sort of waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning and discovering a solution to a puzzle that I'd been working on for weeks in an adventure game. How do you get past this section? And you'd be stuck for weeks and weeks and weeks, and you would have this kind of eureka moment in the middle of the night usually. And I'd sneak downstairs so my parents couldn't see me getting back on the computer to play these games. So it was something that was really exciting. So let's compare that to today. Well, most people today are familiar with game walkthroughs, and we've probably all used one at some point. The entire game and all of its mysteries are spelled out for you in detail. You can instantly access answers to all of the puzzles in the games and points without it costing you anything in terms of any real time or effort or money. The problem that we as gamers and game designers know is that it kind of spoils the fun of the game to have these walkthroughs. I know I play games and think, okay, I've got this new game. I'm not going to use any walkthroughs. I'm going to figure it out for myself. I'm going to have that joy that I used to have back when I was a kid and being stuck on a puzzle for weeks. And eventually I'd get stuck enough that I would go and look at a walkthrough. And then that kind of, from that point forward, ruins my experience of the game, because then I just keep going back and cheating again. So it kind of spoils the reward of being able to solve puzzles yourself. There's no struggling over the puzzle for weeks, and then you don't get that personal satisfaction you get from figuring it out on your own. So some games, of course, have tried to find ways around the walkthrough phenomenon. One is to introduce difficulty levels into the game. So maybe the first time you play through the game, you play it through on easy or normal, and then you can go back and replay the game on difficulty. The trouble is, as a player, you don't necessarily know where your skills lie at the start of the game. So maybe easy is too easy for you, and so on. And once you've gone through the game on easy, it's kind of already been spoiled for you. You know what's going to happen in the game. There's less incentive then to go back and play it on a more difficult level. Other games have tried various types of in-game hints or cheat systems. Samaros 3, for instance, does a pretty good job in that you have to find hint books to get through some of the puzzles. And they're not really obvious hints necessarily. So you have to kind of still do some mind work to solve the problems. Some games have built-in hint systems that increase in the difficulty or obviousness of the hints or clues that they give you. So the first clue might not be very obvious, but you can go and get another clue and go back and get a third clue. And there's some kind of penalty involved. For instance, in the Professor Layton series, you have to find coins in the game and then use those coins to buy hints. But really good game design, I think, understands the player and has kind of built-in clues. So Super Mario Brothers, all of the hidden bricks were completely invisible, but the Zelda games, they kind of figured out that if you had something different in the wall there, that players could figure out that there's something hidden there, and then go and blow up the wall to find a hidden room. And then we as players learned to look for these kinds of clues, and it became another sort of level in playing the game, was to find the hidden spots in the game. So you didn't have to spend all your time pixel hunting to find these clues, but they weren't necessarily really obvious either. Another great example is Half-Life 2. So birds draw your attention by using movement, and that's a hint that there's something in that area that you need to go and explore. So it's not really obvious, but it's saying, hey, there's something here you could look at. So I think what's missing in a lot of games today is that feeling of waking up in the middle of the night, totally excited that I've found a solution to a problem. It might be a keyword that I needed or an object I was supposed to use, and that reward you get from playing the game. So that takes us to the idea of extrinsic and intrinsic motivation and rewards. Extrinsic meaning motivators or rewards that are external to us. Intrinsic meaning the internal pleasure we get from achievement in and of itself. Games used to be nearly all intrinsic rewards and motivators. The gameplay was a motivator in itself. We played because we felt good about ourselves when we played, because we felt like we were accomplishing something. We felt like our skills were improving or we were getting smarter, and so on. So there weren't very many extrinsic rewards in games. We were usually dying over and over. You got very few points compared to games today. And there wasn't a lot of what you get today are these extrinsic rewards. So we get lots of positive feedback from games today. There's lots of visual and auditory bling, as we call it, that makes us feel good. But it's all external. So we're getting achievement badges. I get these achievement badges popping up all the time. It's like, I don't feel like I achieved anything. Why am I getting a badge for this? It's kind of like we're constantly winning a prize, even though we don't even know we're sort of playing the game. So solving puzzles after months of gameplay in old games, that feeling of accomplishment, I don't get that from games anymore. I can't even remember last week whatever games gave me some achievement badge, but I remember games 30 years ago where I solved something and had a strong intrinsic reward from solving the problem. So there's a lot of instant feedback in games that feels really good. It's kind of like junk food. It's like candy. It feels really good at the time, but we're not getting the essential nutrients from the games that we used to get. So I think intrinsic rewards last a lot longer and do a much better job of encouraging repeat play. There's a real sense of accomplishment, not just a quick fix. So I would say one thing we can learn from old games is to not be so afraid of difficulty. And certainly there's popular games today that are quite difficult. Super Meat Boy, for instance, was a hugely popular game and quite difficult. But players have been trained to enjoy these extrinsic rewards, these instant rewards. So we still need some kind of hint systems and extrinsic rewards built in. But you can design for those and have more complicated systems instead of just letting players use walkthroughs. And of course, a lot of this depends on genre and understanding of market and audience. But I still think that there's a lot we can learn from this idea of those intrinsic rewards and how to build them into our games today. So that's one way we can look at game history. As I said earlier, my main interest and focus of my work has been sound, and that's what I've been studying. So I want to quickly show you a couple of examples of what we can learn from early games when it comes to sound. Old game systems, of course, had to fit onto little floppy disks. And there was both a limited amount of memory and a limited amount of disk space to put your audio on. On top of that, the sounds had to be created by synthesizers in real time rather than using pre-recorded samples. The result of that was that a lot of game music relied heavily on melody and became very loop-based. And composers and sound designers developed a lot of techniques to try and overcome that challenge. Well, that limitation of space and memory, of course, changed over time from 8-bit, 16-bit, 32-bit, and so on. The systems got better. We got more memory. We got more disk space, and so on. But the problem is that history keeps repeating. So after we overcame the limitations in home consoles, then we had mobile devices, and we went back to those early limitations again. Then we had online and Facebook games, and we went back to those early limitations again. And now, with new mobile devices and handhelds, there's still some same issues that they had back in the 8-bit days. So the techniques of early game music and sound are still really useful. For instance, real-time synthesis of sound effects was a standard way of making sounds in the 80s. In fact, it was really the only way of making sound for games. Sound was made using dedicated sound chips, and you basically had an oscillator that gave you a sound wave. Usually it was a square wave. Some chips had more advanced sound waves, and it made a simple little buzzy sound, and that was it. So this was your instrument choice. Do I need to do something here to be getting audio from this? Oh, there we go. So you had that basically as your instrument. So that was your guitar or your piano, and you had to make it sound like something good. You could shape that sound by adjusting the frequency, the volume, and using what were called sound envelopes, which was how the sound changes over time. So you could make a slightly different sound, but your alien spaceships made a slightly different buzzy sound than your home base spaceship or other sound effects in the game. And usually that was all you had to work with, a waveform that had volume, pitch, and envelope aspects. Later, like on the Commodore 64, there were additional sort of filters that you could put on that could shape it in a little bit more advanced ways. But coming through to today, this technique is still being used. For instance, the game Peggle Blast, which came out last year on mobile, had a maximum of 5 megabytes for all of the audio in the game. So the sound team were told, you have to basically recreate the experience of Peggle on a mobile device, and you have 5 megabytes of audio. Well, we've probably all downloaded an MP3, and we know that 5 megabytes of audio is about the equivalent of one song. So here you have to have all of your audio, all of your sound effects, all of your music in 5 megabytes for the game. Well, how do you do that? Well, they knew, going back to the old days, they could use this synthesis technique, and then that creates much more room for them to use some sound samples. So they combined recorded sounds, or samples of sounds, with synthesized sounds, using almost exactly the same techniques that they would have used back on the Commodore 64 days. So I'll just play a little clip from Peggle Blast, and you can hear some of the sounds. If you know synthesis, you can hear some of the sounds are being synthesized, some of the sounds are samples. we get audio out from the computer again? Skip ahead. So there's now audio middleware plugins that are really new that go back to allowing for these old synthesis techniques. So this is the Synth 1 plugin for Wise, which is audio middleware that gets used on all the AAA games. And now game sound designers and composers can go back and use these old techniques without it sounding like the 8-bit sound. So the reason for the resurgence of synthesis is not just new platforms that require minimal amounts of space for audio, but also the need for variation. So as audiences, for instance, we don't like hearing the same sound effect 1,000 times. And if you think of footstep sounds, what it feels like to hear 40 hours of exactly the same footstep samples, it gets really boring. So using synthesis, we can allow for some variation in that sound, and you then have kind of endless variation on the sounds. This takes me to another example, No Man's Sky, for instance, a huge game that came out a few months ago with a lot of hype. And you could, in fact, say that it was the hype that has kind of killed the game. It now has the lowest Steam score of any game ever released. Not because it's a bad game, I think, but because the expectations were so high because of all the hype that came out prior to the game's release. Going back for at least more than a year, I was reading articles about the music system, and the big deal that the music system was that it would have a kind of infinite, never repeating music using procedural music generation or generative, algorithmically generative music. The code would basically randomly select segments of pre-composed music and play that back in real time. And isn't that amazing? Well, that technique goes back to 1984 at least in games. LucasArts had a game called Ball Blazer that used pre-composed fragments or segments of music that could play back in a random order. And there were various aspects of it then that were randomized: how fast a segment would play, how loud it would play, what notes the computer could skip, and so on. So all of this was built right into the code. I'm going to skip the video, but I encourage you to go look it up on YouTube. Ball Blazer, it's called. So finally then, I just wanted to take a moment to talk about inclusivity in game audio and how that's changed over time, and what I think we can learn by looking at old games when it comes to inclusivity. So a lot of the games when I played when I was young were actually composed by women, and I didn't know that at the time because nobody really knew who the game composers were. Nobody talked about it. A lot of games didn't even credit composers. It's only been in recent years that it became apparent to me that a lot of these games were actually written by women. Most audio teams, in the West at least, were male, but a lot of them had at least one composer on the team, and a lot of huge games were composed by women. Particularly in Japan, there were a lot of female composers. But my experience of game audio when I began in 2002 was very different from that image of having women involved. This is what an audio party looks like at GDC. These are photos from 2008. I didn't make this collage. Somebody else made this collage. And you'll see that there's not a single woman there. I was actually at that party, but I was the only woman at that party. And there's been plenty of conferences that I go to where it's 99% male. It's getting better at GDC and some of the game conferences, maybe 10% women, but I was just at an audio for AR and VR conference in Los Angeles a couple of weeks ago, and there were a couple of thousand people there. I think about 5 people were women. So it's still very, very much skewed male. So what happened to the women? Why were there more women in game audio's history than there are now? And what can we learn about that history to help more women get into the industry? So those are difficult questions to answer. There's no real one answer. Many factors come together. When I was doing my interviews for Beep, for the film, the predominance of women in Japan's composer scene was a question I was really excited to ask the Japanese women that I interviewed, hoping to hear ideas that I could bring back with me to the West and say, hey, this is what they did to have more women involved in game composition. Unfortunately, the reason for why there were so many women in game audio was not the reason I was expecting, and it actually goes back to the simple fact that they could pay women less. The Equal Employment Opportunity Law didn't come into place in Japan until 1986. So in the early days of video games, it was simply cheaper for companies to hire women, so they hired more women. But I think at least when it comes to the West, there's also other factors as to why women working for companies were working for companies and then later left the industry. So I mentioned I grew up playing the early days. In those days of early video games, marketing of video games was very much skewed both to men and women. There was no sort of, this is a male industry being sold to us. All of the advertising had men and women playing games, and here you have the man as a spectator behind the woman, you know, from a late 70s, early 80s advertisement. Jump ahead to the 1990s, and advertisement became very, very different. It was unquestionably aimed at men. The games that were aimed at women tended to be few and far between and usually weren't very much fun. I remember a 2004 article in the Ottawa Citizen. I was living in Ottawa in Canada, and a new game had come out about cleaning your house, and the title of the article was "Finally a Game for Women," as if women want to play games where you're cleaning your house. So audio has also seen a similar shift in advertising. It used to be sort of gender neutral. Now, audio equipment, you know, I can't look through a Gear magazine without seeing these kinds of advertisements. And this is still happening. It amazes me. So women in game audio, there's a kind of double whammy because the game industry, they've been told, is a male thing. The audio industry, they've been told, is a male thing. So there's very few women getting involved in game audio. This was an article that was in Billboard 2 weeks ago. It's describing there is a wage gap between the men and women in game audio. At least, however, we're getting some awareness built around that issue. So how can we change things for the future? I think part of it is just women becoming more visible in the industry. There are lots of women out there. As I found when I was working on my film, they just weren't as publicly visible. So I think part of it is just showing up, you know, coming out to conferences, talking, being in the audience, showing up for these things. And that helps to create a snowball effect because then more women feel comfortable going to those things as well. And I am out of time. So to summarize then, I believe that there's a lot we can learn from looking at and understanding older games. There's lots of ideas we can borrow, lots of solutions to current technical problems, to design problems, and also to social problems if we go back and look at the way games used to be marketed. So rather than reinventing the wheel and wasting our time, we can learn a lot from studying our own history. And even looking at how marketing in games has influenced the entire culture of the game industry. And we can have a say in how we market our own games in the future. So if you're interested in game history at all, please check out my work or get in touch with me. I'm on Twitter at GameSoundDoc, and you can check out my film and books on beepmovie.com. Thank you. I feel like that was the speed talk because I try to cram that inclusivity stuff there. But if there are any questions, I think we have a minute or two. We can. Any questions? I can't see you. You have to scream if there's a question. Okay. Well, thank you for coming, and thank you, Shruvda, for having this theme of inclusivity. I think it's really important, and I'm really appreciating the audience here being so open to this theme. Thank you.